Good morning, everybody. My name's Ian Harris. I'm the Chief Executive of WSET. Good morning from London. Sorry about the few-minute delay. We've got panelists joining us from literally all over the world, so we had just a couple of tech issues to sort out. I'll be introducing Sarah, who's going to be the Master of Ceremonies, so running this panel once I've just given a brief introduction, and also Wagio, who's going to be doing the moderating of the questions, and I hope there'll be plenty of them. If you'd like to tell us where you're dialing in from, that'd be great. If you want to go into the chat function, you can do that, but it'd be lovely for us to know where you're from and which AVPs you represent. So the other thing is to greetings to our guest panel. We've got a stellar panel here, which and Sarah will introduce them one by one when I've finished this introduction. But welcome to everybody who's on the call, whether you're a guest or indeed whether you're a panelist, to our first ever Global APP Summit. And the reason why I was asked to lead off this session is that as far as WSET is concerned, for us, diversity is very important. The accessibility to WSET courses has always been front of mind. But in June 2020, we provided what we call an employee voice. So we got everybody in the organisation together, and we've got nearly 150 people dotted around the world. And this was to get people's opinions about what we could do in terms of diversity and inclusion. So we had our first internal forum to engage and to listen and indeed to learn from our employees around the world. And as a result, we set up 4 different diversity and inclusion action groups to better understand, but also to address situation and address the issues, and to discuss and agree on the future of diversity and inclusion initiatives. And this is the next stage, to be honest, to be able to talk to our providers around the world. And we know that we are working in an industry which isn't definitely inclusive, and certainly isn't diverse. I've worked in this industry now for 44 years, and I've encountered some pretty horrific examples of lack of diversity. But in terms of our key achievements to date, we're a lot better informed now about D&I than we were 6 months ago. We've done D&I surveys both from our employee perspective, but also for our course providers as well. And we've worked with a broad range of companies in the UK, all of whom are engaging on the D&I agenda, and particularly in the UK and US, helping to fund WSET courses for people from ethnically diverse backgrounds. So that's a great piece of action which is already very much underway. We've also got some very exciting projects in South Africa, which you'll hear about later, and also in Australia. And we're working on a mentorship scheme because we're obviously education to empower people to get into this lovely industry that's been my life for 44 years is really important. But you can't just leave it at that. We've got to have mentorship to help people and guide people from ethnically diverse backgrounds to make their way in this industry. So our commitment at WSET is a D&I, diversity and inclusion, is central. Our mission to provide accessible, best-in-class education and qualifications. That's what we're here to do. And the idea of that is to inspire and, more importantly, to empower people who want to get into the wine and spirit industry, or indeed people who are already in the wine and spirit industry, to progress their careers. And also we have a large cohort of non-industry people as well who we can reach. We do recognise that we can do more. Anybody who says they're doing enough is wrong. That we do realise that we need to do more to achieve this aim of being totally accessible and inclusive. And also we believe that we can help our industry become more accessible and more inclusive, and a more diverse place in which everyone is welcome to work, in particular for individuals from ethnically diverse backgrounds and other underrepresented communities around the world. So we at WSET are in a very good position to lead on this, because both we're a not-for-profit organisation, but also through the positive effect education, and specifically WSET education, can have on improving life chances, but also social mobility. So that's I hopefully set the stall out in terms of the commitment of WSET to the D&I agenda, which we're going to be discussing in a minute. So having started the D&I journey, we've got a long way to go. But now let me just introduce the person who's going to run this session. So I'll be shutting up in about 10 seconds. Sarah Andrew is our Business Development Manager for Australia and New Zealand, and she's also on our global external D&I, Diversity and Inclusion group. So she's going to be running the session from the front end, but at the back end we've got Wagio Waigi, and Wagio is going to be moderating it, having a look at your questions, making sure that everything goes smoothly. So to Sarah and Wagio, thank you very much for making what I'm sure will be a fascinating session on D&I, and again, thank you again for the guests. So that's enough from me. Let's get on to the meat of this session, which is the very impressive panel we've got in front of us. So Sarah, over to you.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Ian. Welcome everyone. I would like to start by acknowledgement of country, being based in Melbourne, and with one of the panel guests, Nathan Lovett, being based in Sydney. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. In terms of a little bit of housekeeping, feel free to use the chat. If you see someone you know, or even someone you don't know but want to reach out to someone in a different part of the world, do please connect. As just been mentioned by Chloe, the Q&A is there for you to field questions. As the panel guests start speaking, they will have 10 minutes each to present. And if we can just ask that we will respond to the questions in the 5 minutes following the presentation. If you have a direct question for one of the panel, please start with their name to make it easier for us then to direct those questions. So overall, I know we started a little bit late, but we will now try to keep on time. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to CATHY MARSTON, who will be the first guest speaker from the International Wine Education Centre in South Africa. We then next have Nathan Lovett from the National Culinary Indigenous Centre. He's based in Sydney, but works nationally, and we are working on a really exciting project that we hope to launch in the coming months. Third, we have Mags JANJO, MW Wine Cellars and BAME Professional. And then last but not very least, we have MIRKO PASTORELLI, wheelchair sommelier based in Italy, who actually was caught up in the pandemic and the lockdown in Australia, and that's how we met almost 12 months ago today. Okay, so I'm just putting up there because I spoke through that fairly quickly, but if you'd just like to see what is appropriate in Australia for any gathering, acknowledgement of country is for someone such as myself that is not Indigenous, and then a welcome to the country is someone more senior and someone that has the authority to do a welcome for country. So today, it's probably worth me saying that the panel came before the theme and the topic. So it was chicken and egg. We had great conversations with CATHY, in which my colleague Cara is speaking to CATHY about some exciting ventures. I was already talking to Nathan. I'd heard about Mags, and MIRKO and I are in contact with each other. And the panel was formed, and then it was a case of trying to work out what the theme or the topic would be. Diversity and inclusivity is front and center in a lot of businesses globally now, but we are very mindful that there's a lot of talk, but there's still not yet much action. And it was actually MIRKO that made a comment to me recently, and he said it again today in our little practice session, that it's not enough anymore just to have words. We're over words. They've been words forever. We now really need to have an action. So that was the seed that was planted in me, trying to work out what the theme would be. So I came up with privilege, how striving for equity in education in the drinks industry will lead to greater diversity and inclusivity. I'm working on an assumption that all of us coming together this evening or this morning have experienced privileges in varying degrees. We understand some of the following concepts. We understand special rights. We understand advantages, benefits, prerogative, entitlement, and even for some birthright. If we consider the fact that industries we work within education, drinks, hospitality, etc., are not equal, then neither are privileges. The opposite to privilege is oppression, in which tangible examples could look something like this slideshow. When I first put this together, it became very clear that the column on the left heavily outweighed the column on the right. I looked at that and then I thought from a broader perspective that that is relevant to education, but it's also relevant to many other industries as well. So thinking about privilege and thinking about oppression got me thinking about the concept of equity versus equality. We quite often talk about equality and wanting to achieve equality. I thought about that a little bit further and I realised that we don't live in a meritocracy. So if we don't live in a meritocracy, how can we achieve equality? If we try to achieve equality, we're setting ourselves up to fail. However, equity is a completely different ballgame. Equity is achievable and action plans are possible with visible outcomes. Equity is giving a person what they need to succeed, to progress, to achieve. It's a level playing field. For all of us here today, this incorporates our audience and many industries that we work within. And I've listed just a few of them for consideration. Drinks, education, wine, spirits, sake, beer, hospitality, tourism, imports, exports, distribution, retail, and marketing. Equity requires someone to speak up, someone to take action, to challenge current systems and procedures because we do not function in a meritocracy. We don't have equality. This is what our panelists have done and are doing to deliver equity, and with this greater diversity and inclusivity. So this was a theme that I set the panelists. Each guest was asked the same question to consider when deciding what they wanted to share with us today. And that question was, how are you striving for equity as a professional to support diversity and inclusivity in your relevant industry? So I'm now just going to hand over to Cathy, and I'm just going to take this down, and if everything goes according to plan, bring up Cathy's presentation.
This is why I made you do it, Sarah, so, you know, if it goes wrong, it's not my fault.
Oh my goodness, my heart's racing.
Pressure, pressure.
Oh, here we go. Okay,
there we are. So
we're all good. So Cathy, I'm now going to mute my mic. I'm going to hand the floor over to you. And just when you're ready for the next slide, just let me know and I'll support you from the back end.
Okay,
thank you.
Awesome. Lovely. Well, thanks so much for having me, everybody. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm very excited to try and tell you what it is that we're doing here in South Africa. I think we maybe have a slightly different approach from a lot of other countries, but we also have probably the biggest gaps that we need to try and fill here. So what I'm going to look at for the next few minutes is how is my business, the IWEC, striving to support diversity and inclusion in South Africa. And I'm going to look at it in a very small way, and then I'm going to end up hopefully talking about the bigger picture and what we need to do. So if we can click on to the next slide, that would be great. Hopefully that's going to work. Fingers crossed. All right, so I'm going to start off really just telling you what our numbers look like right now at the IWEC. These are thumbsuck numbers. I cannot back them up. I have got no stats for this whatsoever. But the feeling of me and my educators, one of whom's watching today, hi Elizabeth, I'm so pleased to have you with me. This is, I think, probably about what we think we're normally teaching at the moment. So on level 1, roughly speaking, we have got about a 50-50 mix between white students and students of colour. Sometimes that depends. So we can teach some courses where we have all students of colour, and a lot of those are bespoke courses that we do, and sometimes it's the other way. But generally, over the years, I think it probably works out at about 50-50. Moving on to level 2, it's about 55-45. Level 3, slightly more skewed now in favour of white students and less for students of colour. And then at level 4, which is the end one where I actually do have concrete numbers because we don't have so many students at that level, there's a very big difference, and I'll talk about why there's a big difference for that later. So just looking at those numbers, I dare say that probably in relation to maybe other people's APPs and businesses, this actually looks pretty good, that we actually have quite a lot of students of colour coming through our hands. But if I can move on to the next slide, you'll see that really it isn't actually very good at all. So this is the breakdown of population stats for South Africa 2020. Now, please excuse the categories and the headings that we've got there. This is the South African categorizations. This is the words that the terms that are used here in South Africa. So of the people that we've got, I can't remember the numbers now. So 57.4 million people, 46.5 of those are Black Africans. Moving on to coloured. Colour is a very specific term here in South Africa, and it refers to people of mixed race. It refers to people with a Khoisan heritage, which is the indigenous people that were first living here in the Western Cape, and it also refers to descendants of Malay slaves who were brought here by the Dutch East India Company in the 17th and 18th century. So that's a very specific term here in South Africa. So I hope that's not that's an explanation why I'm using it, rather than hopefully it's not offending anybody. That's 9% of the population, primarily, as I say, here in the Western Cape. White people 8%, and then Asian Indian 2%. So you can see then, looking at the stats that we've got in terms of our courses, we're not reflecting our customer base at all. You know, we actually have a lot more work that we need to do here if we're going to try and truly do that. Okay, so just moving on then, what is it that we are trying to do? And how, you know, what are the problems that we have? Because it isn't quite as simple as saying, look at us, we've got all these great courses, come and join us and everything like that. There are some very specific conditions here in South Africa that we do need to be aware of, and that not everybody is coming at this from the same backgrounds and with the same ideas. So I've got a few things here that I would term cultural resistance. There are a lot of people in South Africa with very strong religious views, very strong Christian. About 86% of the population is Christian, and there's a very high level of non-drinkers in this country as well. 53.5% of South Africans are lifetime abstainers. They do not drink. Now, obviously those two things are not exclusive to African students of colour, but it does narrow our pool of students considerably. But these last two are very big things that we need to take into consideration as difficulties that we have to overcome if we're going to increase the numbers of Black students on our courses. The legacy of the DOP system. Now, if people don't know what the DOP system is, this was something that has been going on for quite a long time in South Africa, particularly in the wine industry, where wine farmers actually paid their Black workers in wine. So they didn't get money, they were living on the farm, they had their sort of food and things provided by the farmers, but their wages were paid in wine. And what that led to was very high levels of alcohol abuse in lots of different ways. So 58% of all deaths in South Africa relate to alcohol consumption in one way or another. And that can be just from all the diseases that we know that alcohol can cause, so liver disease, etc., etc. Road traffic accidents, which are a huge problem here in South Africa. And then the biggest and the most horrible legacy is that we have the highest prevalence of fetal alcohol syndrome disorder in the world. We actually have more than twice the next highest levels, which comes from Croatia. And this is basically women drinking while they're pregnant and then giving birth to children with irrevocable birth defects. These cannot be changed, they cannot be overcome. And we have the highest incidence of that anywhere in the world. And that is a legacy that we have to be aware of. And the levels of alcohol abuse, and it leads to a lot of resistance, particularly family resistance, to people not wanting their kids to be involved in the wine industry. And you can really understand why that would be, why, you know, a parent is not going to be chuffed that their child wants to go off and study about wine. But it is going to be a problem. Okay, so moving on then to the next slide. Other things that we have issues with, education problems. We have very poor education standards in our government schools. That's a legacy of apartheid, where it was a deliberate policy to make sure that the masses were uneducated, were not able to think for themselves effectively. And that unfortunately has been carried on under the ANC government in the last 25 years since apartheid has finished. We need to acknowledge that the vast majority of our students, and this is mainly students of colour, but also white students as well, are studying WSET in either their second or even their third language. We have 11 official languages here in South Africa, and so a lot of people are not actually, doing their qualifications in first language. We also have a lot of lack of financial incentives for training from the government. There's no real investment in the wine industry. There's no culture of training for people either. This whole thing that we use all the time, what if I educate my staff and then they leave? Well, what if you don't educate them and they stay? For most South African business owners, they never get further than that first part, and I'm not going to spend money on people who are then going to leave me and go on and get great opportunities elsewhere. And that's maybe not commendable, but it is understandable as well. So those are some of the problems that we face from there as well. And then moving on to the next slide, which is the biggest problems that we have, which is financial problems, financial constraints. So the minimum wage in South Africa at the moment is 3,583 Rand per month. That works out at £175 per month. If you're a farm worker, then you get less than that. If you're a domestic worker, which means a cleaner, which is a very, very big number of people in this country, you get even less than that as well. Hospitality workers, who form a big part of our teaching base, it's not unknown, although it is becoming more infrequent, for them to actually get nothing but tips. So then if you look at those are the costs of my courses that I've got underneath there, you can see that this is a real barrier to a lot of people being able to access these courses. Even our level 1 could conceivably be an entire month's salary for somebody to be able to try and access that. So this is a big issue. Okay, so what are we trying to do about this? We're moving on to the next slide there. What are we trying to do to bring about change? Okay, so the cultural things that we're trying to do is we are trying to create visible and positive role models, very much indeed. So I'll start actually at the bottom. So our social media, we have social media. I do a lot personally, and my business does quite a lot of social media as well. And we try very much to focus on positive success stories of people who've been able to take WSET courses and do things, amazing things with their lives, and luckily for us we have a huge pool of people who've been able to do that. So that's actually quite exciting to put people out there so that people can see what they can do with this qualification and how it can actually literally change their lives. We are trying to increase the number of educators of colour that we have. At the moment we have 2 registered to us, and I'm hoping to register a 3rd, but unfortunately he's based in Joburg and I haven't been able to watch him teach as yet, and also we haven't, because we've had fun things like COVID and alcohol bans to contend with. But we are looking to get more educators of colour, again, so that these are positive role models for people to see. Tasting panels as well. We are now becoming known, and I'm very proud of this, as a good source of qualified tasters to sit on tasting panels. So there is a definite consensus with the industry that we are not going to have tasting panels for local competitions and local guides unless they actually do represent people. And we are able to suggest lots of people who are, who've got their level 3, who are studying their level 4, and therefore have got good tasting skills that are proven. So again, we see these people out there, we see them being on these panels, and people can see what is available for them in the future. Okay, so moving on to education, things that we're doing there as well. We do understanding the bits which confuse, I think, is quite important. So, and I know that there's a session tomorrow to 11 talking about people studying not in their first languages, and I hope that's going to be actually very interesting for everybody, certainly for me. What we do is we do a lot of one-on-one coaching for people, particularly at level 3 level. We understand that the South African schooling system is very much a sort of a rote learning and a regurgitation system. It's not an explanation and critical thinking sort of model. So we try and do an awful lot of one-on-one coaching for people who are struggling at that level, to try and make sure that they can explain and describe and understand fully what the questions are asking. We have to add a lot of explanations to language, and this is a little tiny bugbear of mine that I have passed back on various occasions. There are a lot of English words that we don't understand here in South Africa. You know, people don't know what flabby means. We just don't use that word over here. We don't know what tart means if you're not talking about something that's got lemon curd and meringue on top. We don't understand that stuff. So it means that every time that we teach level 1 in particular, we have to have time to explain what those words are, so that if they come up in the questions, my students are not going to be like, don't know, can't do this, you know. So we have to do those extra bits in there for people. And there'll be feedback quite regularly to WSET confusing languages. There are some questions that I think are quite confusing, and I keep nagging away there to try and get those kinds of things changed. So that's what we're doing there in educational. And then financial, moving on to that next slide there. We try and do as much as we can, but you know, we're not a big business, we are quite a small business, so we do the best that we can. We offer payment plans, and these are taken up a lot by our students. There's a very big culture in Africa of Ubuntu, of sharing. So very often we get payments from people and we don't actually know who they are, because they're not necessarily from the person who's sitting the course. But people's families will help them out, their friends will help them out, and eventually we can get the payment through and we can get these people on courses. Our prices have been frozen for the last couple of years. We haven't really felt that we could put our prices up. I don't know if that's what anybody else is feeling. It's been too difficult for us, I think, in the market that South Africa is. And in this last year, we've had to offer very flexible refund terms for students who've started to pay deposits to do courses and then have had to email us through and say, look, I've lost my job, I don't have a hope of another, they've closed the restaurants again, there's another alcohol ban, I really need that money back because I have to pay rent. And what can you do? You know, that's something that we've had to be much more flexible of. Good points though, and very bright points, is that we do get a lot of sponsorships and bursaries, and we are massively grateful for that. The IWC, the International Wine Challenge, has been a game changer for a lot of students here in South Africa. The Cape Wine Auction, which is a local auction, very big on education, Cape Winemakers Guild, which is an association of the top winemakers in the country, all of those have been involved in helping to sponsor students, and WSET themselves. So we move on to the next slide. I'll just talk you through very quickly the biggest project that we've been doing to date with the WSET and IWC has involved the Pinotage Youth Development Academy. So this is a one-year program to basically encourage previously disadvantaged young people, and again that's a very South African specific term, and it denotes people whose families have historically suffered from lack of opportunities under the apartheid system. So this is previously disadvantaged young people, to encourage them to develop their skills and fulfil their potential within the wine industry. So far we've got 145 students have passed level 2, which is 78% of all the people who sat the exam. We've got merits, we've got distinctions, and what that translates to is a massive game changer for people when they actually hit the employment sort of, you know, sector. So 90% of the graduates of this program are now in full-time permanent employment, and this WSET qualification has opened up opportunities for people to go work on yachts, cruise ships, and basically to lift themselves out of the poverty situations that they have found themselves in, very much because of their inability to access opportunities. If you want to have a look, there's a link there at the bottom. I don't know if you can click on the link, but I think it is possible to get these slides and have a look at that link later. This is the story of a girl called Shannon, but she is one of many who have taken this qualification and who have literally, they've changed their lives and the lives of the people around them. So there's awesome things that we've been able to do thanks to sponsorship from WSET and the IWC. That's been amazing. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. What else are we going to do? We move on to the next slide and looking forward. Things that we need to do next. I don't quite know. I'm thinking maybe I've got these in a slightly different order, so I might just change it around a second. So don't go forward just yet, Sarah. I'm going to look at the second one first. Mentorship, and I see that Sarah's been talking about this in the chat, but mentorship is a very important thing that we need to get a handle on here in South Africa. There is a very big tendency at the moment for, particularly within the sommelier sector, for what we call window dressing. Okay, so for people to be able to put a black somm on the floor and say, look at us, we've ticked a box, you know, we're all like, you know, inclusive, etc., etc., but they're not giving that somm the opportunity to actually fulfill their role properly. So yes, they're on the floor, yes, they're taking the orders, but they're not doing the back office, they're not responsible for the wine list, they're not spending the money, they're not managing the cellar, and until that happens, that is not proper inclusivity, and that is not actually equity. So we're trying very much indeed to make sure that the students that are getting into positions are real positions of power and responsibility, and are going to be forging careers and not just helping someone tick a black economic empowerment box, which is a very big concern for us here in particular. Things like changing the language. So if you want to move on to the next slide, then I'm going to talk to you about Kamusha wines. So this is a project by a level 3 graduate, and this is the guy I'm hoping will eventually become a lecturer for me as well. So Tinashe Naidumoko is a Zimbabwean Zim Som, and he now has his own wine brand, which he is marketing very successfully in South Africa, and is now trying to market in his home country of Zimbabwe. And one of the things that he's come across very quickly is that obviously in Zimbabwe they have a massive range of different fruits and vegetables and flavours that are not necessarily related to the European ones that perhaps we're all more familiar with. So what he's done this whole series of different slides explaining how the Zimbabwean terms relate to the other terms that you might see elsewhere. So but he's not talking about black currants for Cabernet Sauvignon, he's talking about subvu, which is an indigenous fruit in Zimbabwe, and which is going to help make his wines resonate more with Zimbabwean customers. The same with Sauvignon Blanc, he's not talking about melons, he's talking about gaka or magaka, we're having lots of them. And I think this is a really interesting project. So if you want to see more about it, you can look at his website, kamushabrands.com. He's a great guy, and I think this is going to be a really good game changer. If we could get those sorts of things going in South Africa as well, that would make me very happy indeed. So just moving back then to the slide that we have at the end, just want to sort of finish up on my last point. We can just move forward, there we go. A mental shift, you know, we're talking about diversity and inclusion, but South Africa actually isn't interested in inclusion. Inclusion really means, you know, we're not looking to necessarily just get more people on our courses that are of colour. We're not looking to get more people, you know, sort of when we go to tastings, we don't want to see more black faces there. That isn't actually what we want to do in South Africa. We're not interested in inclusion. We want transformation. And that is a big difference for us. It's the word that we use a lot in our wine industry here, that we need to transform it so that South Africans can stop looking at their industry through a European colonial mirror and actually look at what do we want here in South Africa. How can we actually make our wines relevant to people in South Africa, and how can they create something that is going to be uniquely South African and take that out to the rest of the world. So I don't know how that's going to be done. I am the last person in the world to tell you how the South African industry is going to transform, but it is going to transform. And the best thing that we can do as WSET lecturers is actually try and create those agents of change. Okay, so we are looking to people to be able to look at what we have going on and to take that European legacy of winemaking, but we are then wanting our students and our leaders that we're helping to create in this country, we now need them to go off and we need them to transform and change our industry. And that's what we have in the back of our minds here in South Africa. So I think that's enough for me. I've got quite passionate about this and I'm happy to chat till kingdom come. I'm just going to end on one more thing. Please, everybody, buy South African wine. We are now in our 3rd lockdown. People cannot get their grapes into their cellars because their cellars are full because they cannot sell their wine. Please, please buy South African wine at every opportunity you can. You're our only hope. We can't drink it locally. We can't buy it, we can't use it for teaching. I cannot teach at all at the moment with wine. So if you have any chance at all, the South African wine industry really needs your support. Go buy some South African wine. Okay, that's it. That's for me. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting.
Oh, that was wonderful, Cathy. Thank you. And I just love, I love your choice of words and your powerful words. And it's the language that we need that will also drive change. So thank you very much for that presentation, really inspiring, and some great comments for some other APP. Obviously we are running a little bit behind. Has anyone got any questions? Waggy, are there any particular? I know some have been answered along the way.
I do believe some have been answered along the way. That was a brilliant presentation, yes, Cathy. Thank you so much. There's a lot there that a lot of APPs and people can take away from the work that you've been doing. So thank you so much. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A or the session chat for any questions to Cathy.
Perfect. What we might do, just to keep things moving on, is we might introduce the next panel guest. And obviously, if anyone's got any questions for Cathy, we will pick them up and we'll have a little bit of time at the end. So once again, thanks very much. MIRKO, would you like to take the stage next and share with us your wonderful story that you're sharing with us this evening? Are you there, MIRKO? I think he might have had to take his phone off and on. Great, welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
Perfect. So this was the first thing that I talked when I saw the picture of Yannick Benjamin 3 years ago on Google, the first wheelchair sommelier in the world. My story was that I worked as a web developer for many years in Italy, but at some point in my life, I felt that this was not for me. So one day, under advice of a friend, I started a sommelier course here in Italy with the ASPI Association, only for the passion at the beginning, because I always been passionate about wine world, the sommelier world, and I wanted to know that industry more in depth. And for curiosity, one day in my office, I type on my computer on Google the words wheelchair sommelier, and when I saw the picture of Yannick, something changed forever inside me. Seeing Yannick, I say to myself, if he can do it, I can do it too. So I immediately decided to take the long path to become a sommelier. And it was a challenge to myself, but I thought about the future implication that this could move. For example, giving new hope to people with disability around the world and change the perception of it inside the drink industry and in the sommelier industry. I started chatting with Yannick, first from Italy, and in 2018, when I was studying to become a sommelier, I moved in New York during the Wine Aways event, a large charity wine tasting event, 12 people with disability in America, And this happened the day after my father passed away, so it was incredible. And it was a big success. And 1 year later, after 1 month after I received my sommelier diploma in Italy, I came back in New York, always during the WSET, and I received the WSET award for my determination and my desire to change the perception of disability in the hospitality industry in Italy. So this was a wonderful goal for me, and it was fantastic. But I felt that this was not enough, because in Italy and in many European countries, the disability is not always seen as a positive thing. So I started to, I created a slogan on my social media to inspire and motivate other people with the same word that gave me hope at the beginning, which is sommelier. And, you know, I don't want to be a subcategory, because I'm a sommelier, I'm a professional like others. But I think it's necessary to underline apparent condition of disadvantage to in a positive way, to transform it in a positive way, to motivate not only myself but the other people. And I think this is very important, especially in Europe and in countries like Italy. And talking about Italy, here is very difficult to find accessible restaurants and bars. So to make my first experience as a sommelier, I started to contacting a lot of people from all over the world in the sommelier industry and in the wine industry to make my first experience as a sommelier. And it was very difficult at the beginning. And I found this place in Melbourne, in Australia, at the Vue du Monde restaurant. And despite the difficult situation with the coronavirus, I took one of the last available flights from Italy the last year in March to follow my dream, to make my first experience as a sommelier. And after 1 month of work, everything there closed for the coronavirus. And it was difficult because I stayed for 6 months in lockdown in a room without seeing the light of the sun outside. And that was crazy, but my dream and my passion, my determination was more bigger than this situation. And I came back in Italy in October, and from this experience, I learned a very important thing. I think that the job of the modern sommelier is not only to work in a restaurant and wine bar, but the sommelier can work collaborating with wineries, can create something with some event in a restaurant, or he can work as a writer, as a wine writer, or in the import-export area. So the field of application can be infinite. If you have a disability, if you have any type of diversity, you can work without problem. So it's not a problem. And my story, a story like mine, must be seen not as a pretext to achieve fame or success, because I'm not interested in that, but to help give new hope to the people who think that in face of difficulties, they cannot react. That's it. And I chose this passion knowing that it would be difficult, but I'm happy with what I was able to achieve, thanks to my determination, but also thanks to the help of the people and friends who have supported me all over the world. And I can say one thing, that it's just the beginning, because the real challenge starts now. In our industry, topics such as diversity and inclusion will be central themes in the coming years. I'm 100% sure about that. I'm proud of, in my small way, little small way, I have helped to raise this phenomenon in the sommelier world. And only if we remain united, we can change the things. And this can only happen through determination, constancy, humility, and passion, and especially communication. In my life, I always thought big, and I think that I have moved something bigger than me and bigger than all of us. So I'm sure that other disabled people will appear in this industry in the coming years, and we must be ready to help them in any way. Personally, I will continue to keep the name of Wheelchair Sommelier in my social media to inspire other people. Other disability people may prefer to not put it. Their point of view is not really important. But a really important thing is to remain united again. And I want to say something to those who listen us now. You must always follow your dream. You must always share your stories as much as possible, your doubts, your difficulties, everything. Because if you stay in silence, nobody can help you. That's it. And only in this way we can help each other to improve the world. Thank you.
Bravo, MIRKO. That was absolutely wonderful. What such an inspiring story, and for sharing the journey that you've been on, especially the time that you had in Australia, because I do know how isolated you were. We were 12 kilometres from each other and couldn't meet in person because we were in a 5-kilometre radius lockdown, and you literally almost went past my house to fly back to Italy and I still couldn't see you. I love the fact in your story, if I can read one sentence out, my story must not be seen as a pretext to achieve fame or success, but to help give new hope to those who think that in the face of difficulties you cannot react. You are asking for, MIRKO, and you are striving for equity for those with a disability. You're being a voice, you're being an action. And again, earlier tonight, you made one comment which I found really inspiring. If you can only help just one person, it will be a success. So I know already you've helped more than one person. So thank you very much for sharing your story this evening. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you too. It's an honor to be here to talk about my story. And I think that if we change one life outside here, this can be a success. So step by step, we will change everything. We will change the world.
Wonderful, wonderful. So there are some lovely comments coming in on the chat, MIRKO, and I know that you're on your phone and it's a little bit smaller for you to see, but there's thank yous, there's inspiring, inspirational, and very important that you've shared your story. So lots of positive support, and it's been wonderful having you on our guest panel. If any questions come in, Waggy will capture them for you, MIRKO, and we'll address them at the end. So we'll let you know if there are any specific questions. Okay, moving on. We're next going to head to Australia. Nathan Lovett from the National Culinary Indigenous Centre. Nathan and I caught up with each other partway through the pandemic and have started talking about some initiatives. And since setting up the global external diversity and inclusivity project group, we've got some really interesting discussions and hoping that some actions will come to fruition in the coming months. So Nathan, I'd love to hand over to you to share exactly what your business has been doing and the incredible change that you're making to the culinary hospitality industry in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody for joining us. My name's Nathan Lovett. I'm the CEO of the National Indigenous Culinary Institute. I'm a Yuin man. My Aboriginal family come from the south coast of New South Wales, around an area called Moruya. I live on Wallumattagal land, which is just in the northwest of Sydney, around Epping, Beecroft, that type of area. It's part of the Darug Nation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm on, and have the great pleasure of living, and acknowledge everybody around the world and the lands of traditional owners that we're all sitting on. Just like wine, just the way in which wine is connected to the land and how it's produced, and the quality of the wine is dependent upon the land it's on. Our culture is so closely connected to our land, not just through our food, but through our songlines, which tells our story, and how we pass our knowledge down from generation to generation, and also our law. And in Aboriginal law, that's about how we live our lives and how our culture has thrived for tens of thousands of years here in Australia. My background prior to being in this role is working in employment and education programs. I'm a qualified teacher and have had some teaching experience as well, but most of my background has been working with young Aboriginal people and building a pathway for employment from whichever year they are in school, developing the aspiration and creating that pathway into, attaining that career. A lot of the typical issues that I see here in Australia with young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and even people of all ages is the intergenerational issues that we've inherited for the last 220 years, and the way in which we've been displaced off our land. We've been turned away from education. We haven't been able to access education. We've been forced into slavery. We've been forced off our land. We've been forced not to speak our language and not to pass down our stories and our culture. And that disconnection to our culture and our way of living has caused irreparable trauma, and issues that are continuing now with young people in 2021, which is unimaginable for a country such as Australia's standing. There are people who live in third world conditions here in Australia, no doubt, no similar to South Africa and other places around the world that have had similar issues with how their countries have grown over the past few centuries or transpired. Some of the other issues here in Australia for employment is within this industry in particular is the location of wineries. Here in Australia, a lot of the wineries traditionally are a very strong farming land and were either farmed prior to becoming wineries or were wineries straight away. And in a lot of cases, a lot of wineries are still in the same family who took the land from the traditional landowners, which is a barrier in itself for Aboriginal people to work in that industry, or particularly close to where they live, being that the people they would work for are making their business and their money off land that we never received money for. And so we've already started from well beyond the starting point that everybody else has in colonising Australia and free settlers coming to Australia and receiving land and receiving gifts and cattle and all these different things. Aboriginal people was the opposite. We were displaced. Our land was taken off us. Very similar to America, in which slaves have built the economy in America prior to the revolution in cotton industry and others where no salaries were paid. I think Cathy mentioned things like being paid in wine. In her presentation here in Australia, it was common for Aboriginal people to be paid with rations, and a lot of the time those rations were poisoned. And there's a whole range of other things similar to that have impacted our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. Also, the location of wineries, and in particular, I'm talking about working in the development of wine, not necessarily the serving of wine, which happens obviously in our restaurants and places. And I'll talk more about the Culinary Institute in a second, but in particularly in the development, production of wine, a lot of our wine regions, whilst they're pretty close to metropolitan areas, aren't exactly in urbanised areas. And so you need a license and you need a car to be able to get to work, which is a huge problem for a lot of Aboriginal people. Still coming from, my grandmother never had a license, never had a car, still alive. I'm only one generation removed. My brother doesn't have a license or a car. So that's the same generation. And these are employment barriers to a lot of Aboriginal people. Whilst a young person might be able to, and I've worked with plenty of young kids who have done this, they've been able to get a job at 14, 15, buy a car at 16, 17, 18, whatever, but they don't have anybody who can teach them to drive. And so that's another barrier of, whilst they might be able to buy a car, they don't have somebody who can teach them to drive the car. And the minimum amount of hours here in New South Wales that you have to go through on a learner's license to progress to a P's license, very difficult and very expensive to do if you don't have somebody teaching you and you have to pay an instructor. So that's just some of the other barriers that that we're focused on there, or that impact us here. And the other one is that a lot of the locations, and this comes back to the displacement of land, the Indigenous population in those areas are generally lower than the population rate of Australia, of Indigenous people. And a large part of that is because Aboriginal people were forced off that land into missions, into other areas. In some cases, people were shifted from one mission to another. A mission would close down because they wanted that land for mining or for farming or for whatever reason. And so the mission would be moved. And people who lived on one country, and people in Europe could get a really good vision of this, people who were potentially living in France were just shifted across into Spain, and now you live in Spain. And that's what it was like here in Australia, where we had over 600 clans, 600 nations, and people were just being picked up and forced and moved around. So we were enforcibly living with people that we may have been warring with, and being forced into missions together, not being able to speak our native tongue, not being able to speak our language, not being able to pass our stories down, and losing that connection straight away. So, a lot of these locations, there's also less people who live around those locations. And in some cases, and Mudgee, which is a pretty iconic wine area, it's also well known for an Aboriginal massacre. And that's also the case where, a lot of people were pushed off the land. It wasn't exactly done nicely. And these are the atrocities that are still attached to these regions and other areas. And so that's a huge issue for a lot of people who might live on Wiradjuri land out in that area, would probably never work for a winery because the land has been stolen off them. It's it's still so raw. We're not talking 1788 for that to have happened. That was in the 1800s, not that far ago. And we're only talking 2 generations, 3 generations, and that's still felt out, especially out in that region. That's still felt really strongly, and it's not the only area that has taken place. Some of the main things with working in employment with Aboriginal people, this is the last thing before I get to our institute and what we're working on, is that a lot of young Aboriginal people are focused on where their role models are. So we will see, whether it's family members, people who live in our community, or just whoever we see, whether it's media or however we're seeing them, they're the types of careers that young people tend to aspire to. They'll see somebody being successful in banking, and they'll want to do banking. And that's because they can see themselves in doing that because they see another Aboriginal person in being successful. And that's where these types of programs and these types of initiatives for diversity and inclusion, and it's not just Indigenous people, it's across all different types of diversity. And I love that we got to hear from MIRKO before about his background and experience. Some of my work when I was at a bank here in Australia, I was working on disability programs and refugee programs as well. So it's really great to see MIRKO doing something that's breaking ground for others to follow. Is that Aboriginal people will want to work where they see other Aboriginal people being successful. And until we can really break that mold and create that opportunity to get people in these roles, become sommeliers, working in the wine industry, producing wine. There's a wine owner, and I'll speak to that in a second, and getting more of that, we will see more Aboriginal people want to work in that industry. So the wine that I mentioned is grown from a couple of different wineries, or co-produced from a couple of different wineries, but it's called Mount Yengo Wines. It's owned by an Aboriginal man named Gary Green, and he's actually one of our directors with the National Indigenous Culinary Institute. And he owns a number of businesses, including Mr. Wagyu Beef. But he created his wine brand because he wanted to break that stigma that's so closely attached to Aboriginal people here in Australia. And Cathy mentioned it as well, as the alcoholism and the negative connotations that are attached between Aboriginal people in Australia and alcohol. So he wanted to create a positive story around Aboriginal people owning an alcohol brand and creating that at a high end and utilising that to promote good stories about Aboriginal people. It's creating a lot of opportunities for us. Our relationship with the National Wine Foundation has led to a large opportunity for the Culinary Institute to now start helping develop pathways for Indigenous people to work in wineries around Australia. And we're doing that through our chef program. So the Culinary Institute started in 2012 with the focus of creating employment pathways for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in Australia to work in fine dining restaurants. It's an area of the industry that's significantly underrepresented compared to other areas of the industry. And in the past 9 years, we've been quite successful at having just over 200 people through our program. We have sous chefs and chef de parties working in some of the best restaurants here in Sydney and Melbourne, Rockpool, Catalina's, Movida, and our alumni working around the world. We've got a sous chef in Tokyo. We've got a chef who's worked in Fat Duck in London. We've got quite a lot of success in what we've achieved. We've gone international. We cooked at the 2019 Taste of Cork Food Festival. We've cooked for the Australian ambassador in Ireland. We're running a reverse program back here in a couple of months in Australia for the Irish ambassador to Australia and a group of dignitaries here. So we've been quite successful with what we've achieved. And through our relationship with the National Wine Foundation, we're now using that to grow into wine regions. And so in 2020, we established a program in the Hunter Valley, and we have apprentices working in the wine region in the Hunter Valley, becoming qualified chefs. We used to have a qualified chef working in Mudgee, and we're working on getting a second one out there, but our first one has shifted across to a local Aboriginal-owned cafe in Mudgee, but is still in the area, and hoping in 2021 that we can run some more targeted programs around some of our wine regions in the Southern Highlands, particularly around Mudgee, Orange, the Hunter Valley, and continue to develop that pathway with commercial cookery apprenticeships. But also through that, and particularly in working with Sarah, we've identified that not everybody, and we already know this, but not everybody who comes to do our initial program as a pathway ends up becoming a chef, but they might still be really interested in working in the hospitality industry. And our hope, particularly with WSET, is that we can introduce them to this program and this pathway, and perhaps we create some of the world's best sommeliers, being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, coming through this program and learning a different skill set and working in a different area of the industry. Perhaps they end up working in some of our restaurants that we already have chefs in, but in a front of house capacity, and in a way that our founding board members and group who were involved in founding our organisation never really thought about. But that's what this opportunity will create. So it's very exciting to be working with Sarah and to be working on a different initiative that still brings Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to the area of the industry that we're focused on, and still being able to work with our restaurant partners in a different way. And hopefully what it really does is just create more role models of Aboriginal people doing incredible things here in Australia that young people will look up to them and say, that's actually something I want to do, and not do it because someone like me sits in front of them and says, this is something that would be really good for you, but because they read about it, they see it. There is a lot of really positive PR that we're able to get out, and other publications, we're putting out there about different chefs and different people who work in the industry, restaurant owners and cafe owners and suppliers and different things working in the hospitality industry. We're really hopeful that we can be a part of that and just building a larger employment opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in Australia.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you for sharing, Nathan, and the historical content, as challenging it is to hear, and for many of the audience would not be aware of the history of the Indigenous and Australia, and not the extent of it, but the fact that you're driving change through your institute, and you're driving change not just through chefs, but through hospitality, through tourism, through marketing. It's really exciting that WSET can come on board and that we can mirror what you've already done, because you do have programs in place, and the synergy is really exciting. For those of you in the session tonight, Nathan and I have a very ambitious plan, and are very excited to, in several years' time, have the first Indigenous APP in Australia. So we won't stop until that happens. But for anyone, if you've got any questions, Nathan may have to jump out. He has got 3 sick children at home. It's nearly 9 p.m. So if he has to jump out, there's an apology, but if you've got any questions, we'll make sure we can get them to him, and we might be able to populate something into the booth. But Nathan, thanks so much for sharing, and I'm really excited to be working with you.
Yes, thank you so much, Nathan. I have a question for you, if that's all right.
Sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, sorry, I thought my mic had frozen. Yeah, you mentioned there are negative connotations between alcohol and obviously the culture of the Aboriginal people in Australia. So I just want to ask if becoming cultural things that are personal to people's culture, and obviously including them in an industry that they would actually find to perhaps go against their culture or their beliefs even.
I'm sorry, it cut out a couple of times, but I think I got the majority of the context of the question. The first part, just to explain a little bit more around that negative. Alcohol was introduced to Australia in 1788, arguably. It may have been here earlier through trade, through different routes with Asia and different populations, but it takes a long time for the human body to adapt to something. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, having only consuming alcohol for 4, 5, 6 generations, it's taking a long time for that biological adaptation to alcohol and being able to handle it the same way in which sort of Anglo, who have been drinking for thousands of years or however long it has been, in its different ways. It's a whole different issue, and it's also brought on other health issues like cardiovascular disease and diabetes and other things that it kind of offsets with. And so we don't have that adaptability to alcohol as early as other areas. And so also to go with the trauma and the issues that a lot of our population has faced, people who are going through terrible hardship, what do they turn to? They turn to alcohol and they turn to drugs. And that's been one of the other issues. So a little bit more, I guess, more targeted towards what your question was about was, whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would be willing to work in an industry that has those negative connotations or has, issues with our community, is that there's other areas of employment where this happens anyway. And this is a legitimate ongoing question and discussion that I do have with multiple people is, even things like, is it appropriate for our graduation with our students to have wine at the graduation? And my thought is yes. Why would we want to deliberately, portray that or put in the minds of the people as part of our program that, no, you can't handle alcohol, so, we're not going to allow you to drink just because we don't trust you. And I've been to plenty of different events where, because it's an Aboriginal event, it's not being run by Aboriginal people, but the organisations running it don't allow alcohol. And it's because they believe that, a room full of 3,000 uni students might get a bit crazy if they have a few glasses of wine. I used to live at a housing college on one of Australia's leading universities here in Sydney. You give wine to any university student, they're going to get a bit rowdy. So it's something that I believe that if we build positive stories around it and we have the right approach to it, and particularly when it's involved in providing employment and education outcomes, that has a really significant impact on not just the individual, but the family and the community. That's when it's done right, it's not an issue. And there's already plenty of examples where alcohol, other things, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are working in these industries. It just might not be at the level at which we're discussing. In particular, either production of or working in high-end restaurants or working in as sommeliers or in those high-level positions. I mean, I worked for 5 years while I was at uni as a bartender and cocktail maker. Nothing too special, but it didn't cause any problems. And plenty of my other friends had similar experiences. I mean, we all go to restaurants, we all eat, in these types of places. I think it's just that there's a lot more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who don't have issues than who do. It's just the negative stuff is what gets higher, the higher level of focus, in particular those in remote communities where there's other issues as well. So I guess that's a long answer to a question, but yeah, I think the more we focus on the positive and build those positive role models in it, it's just an afterthought instead of oh, should we do something about this? Or it's a great industry to work in. It leads to a lot of opportunities, and I really believe that our connection to the land and the grape, there's a lot of really positive reasons for why we should be involved in the wine region.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, well said, Nathan. Well answered. And the common theme seems to be running that it's the agents, it's the role models, it's having people front and centre that the younger generation can look up to. And that's what's missing at the moment. And that's the change that we need to create. And it's the equity that we need to consider to make that happen. So thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. I'm mindful that we started 15 minutes late, so we're actually doing quite well for time considering. I'm now immediately going to hand over to Mags JANJO, MJ Wine Cellars and Bang Wine Professional. So thank you.
Good morning all, can everyone hear me? Fab. Good morning. Such an inspiring panel to share with. Such great stories come from, from Cathy's stories to MIRKO's to Nathan's. I've certainly found myself thoroughly educated. I've learned so much just by sitting here. Nathan, such a powerful session. I mean, we consider wines coming out from all over the world, but there's just so much history attached to wine that sometimes we do not consider, and we might just kind of blindly power through and think, well, why isn't this working and why isn't that working? I think sessions like this are really important to educate us and to teach us about some of the obstacles which we might face when we are trying to, break down barriers and break down molds. It's very important to consider the human and the cultural aspects to things. So my name is Mags JANJO. I've been in the UK for about 15 years. Emigrated from Cameroon, West Africa. So I really do resonate with some of those challenges which Cathy mentioned about, coming from a traditional non-drinking, Christian background to being that person who says, hey, I want to go and do wine. It was a very interesting conversation to have with my parents, while my sister was talking about going off to Oxford to go study. I was, yeah, wine is the stuff, wine is the thing that I'm going to go do. So I set up MJ Wine Cellars really after working in the industry for about 13 years because there was no one else doing it. There was nothing else like it. We, as a member of underrepresented ethnic background, there was, I quite found that there was a lot of responsibility on the art of showing people what was possible and making things, showing non-diverse backgrounds, things that could be done. I also do some wine education, and I've been educating for the last 3 years or so, set up a couple of APPs, and also teach for the WSET in Bermondsey. And I've seen firsthand the power of wine education. People coming into the class and not really wanting to speak, not really wanting to participate in the class, but after 2 or 3 sessions, gaining confidence to be able to chat about wine, to be able to talk about wine confidently, and really finding a new kind of passion, a new enthusiasm for something which just a week ago they did not want to engage in. The wine education has a real power, has real potential to be able to, as Cathy says, transform people's lives and open opportunities which they might have not considered, just a couple of weeks or a couple of months ago. We are blessed to work in an industry where more often than not, to be able to work in the wine industry, you need to have some sort of wine qualification. It might be going down the Sommelier route, or it might be going down the WSET route. That's quite powerful because you can walk into any wine establishment, into a pub, a restaurant, a wine bar, and you can speak the same lingo. You can kind of chat from the same book. And not many industries share what we share. This, I think, or I believe, is a blessing and a curse, because from a consumer's point of view, this is great. A consumer can walk into a wine shop and know that they'll be educated, or know that they'll be guided by someone who's got a qualification, or someone who's spent time, studying that subject. It's also great from us who already are in the industry, knowing that I can go to a winery, or I can go to, a pub, a bar, and chat with people who also share my passion, I will meet other WSET graduates, other WSET alumni. But from a point of getting more inclusivity and diversity, it then begins to act as a barrier. Because, as most people will know, to get a wine job, most people, the job description or the job specs will ask you for a certain amount of education. And that education comes at a cost more often than not. We sat down in our work with BAME Wine Professional, which I shall talk about shortly, and we costed, how much would it cost from someone coming out from a non-wine background, has, zero kind of understanding of the wine world, and says, right, I want to make a complete switch into the wine industry. How much will that cost in pounds sterling? And we came up with a number that's between 10 and 15,000 pounds. Now, more often than not, when you think about the wine industry, it's an industry which I would say 9 times out of 10 people tend to fall into. They would have had a first career, they would have had something else that they do, and go to a party, go to a pub, go to a tasting, and discover, oh great, this is amazing, I want to be involved in that. And more often than not, people would have gone to university, would have acquired student loans, and they're therefore hesitant to take on more education with that amount of cost attached to it. And when we're thinking about people from underrepresented backgrounds or from ethnically diverse backgrounds, if you look at the demographic or the statistics, these are more often than not people who are kind of working class people who are just about living paycheck to paycheck. And so they becomes a real financial challenge in getting people who are not in the wine industry, coming from different ethnic backgrounds, to be able to kind of tap into that. So the passion might be there, the enthusiasm might be there, but more often than not, it falls short on that financial end. So we decided last year, I was doing some work with Jancis Robinson, MW. We were trying to kind of highlight, people from different ethnic backgrounds who have gone on in the wine industry to do great things, and we couldn't find enough of them. And we were looking about 4 or 5 in the UK. And we thought that, going back to Cathy's slide, that wasn't a representation of the world that we live in. You look at the ethnic split of the United Kingdom. We've got so much more. We've got such a rich and such a diverse, culture, or such a diverse demographic, that when you look at those who are studying wine and those who are working in the wine industry, the industry isn't a representation of the world that we live in. So we decided to set up BAME Wine Professionals, which was the objective was to say, listen, if you're out there, come out. We're trying to find different members from different ethnic backgrounds, group them together in terms of looking at what sector of the industry do you work in. It might be retail, it might be hospitality, it might be logistics, whatever it might be media comms, and create a conversation going. It is kind of twofold. And on one hand, we chat amongst ourselves. On the other hand, it acts as a platform where there's so many different companies in the UK who are kind of getting woke to the idea of, right, we work in a privileged industry, we live in a privileged part of the world, and we want to do something to kind of even the scales out, but we have no idea where to start. So BAME Wine Professionals was that kind of database, or was that kind of contact where you could reach out and say, I'm trying to do X, I'm trying to do Y. We understand that, the dial is skewed towards our direction. We want to, kind of even the dial a little bit more. What can we do? So essentially, we offer opportunities, we offer education, we offer, at some point when we're allowed to visit the world, travels, and so on and so forth. And we have been doing some great things. We've worked with people like Louis Rodera. We are also communicating with the WSET, with Majestic Wine in the UK, who are one of the UK's largest retailers. And last year, we were able to consult with Majestic to offer 24 places for WSET Level 2. Now, if you think about the wine industry as the highway, the WSET education or WSET qualifications are your driving license. You can't get on that highway without having, some sort of education. So what we are trying to do here is we're trying to create a conveyor belt of education where we get some people who are doing level 2s, chat with other companies and say, listen, I've got, 24 people who've just passed in level 2. Of that 24, we've got 12 really strong candidates who've got interest in studying wine. What else is there a possibility of working with you to be able to create, opportunities for these guys to study? Now that studying, I firmly believe, makes up only one of 2 parts of being able to work in the wine industry. you have to combine that study with work experience. So we are also being linked. We're also working with companies around the world where we're saying, listen, we've got some guys who have shown great, appetite for this, great theoretical knowledge, but they're finding it difficult to break into the industry. Can you offer a 3 months placement? Can you offer a 6 months placement? Whatever that means. So the idea is we are trying to get someone from a complete novice. All they have is a passion for wine. Get them into WSET level 2, level 3, whatever it might be, as well as combining work experience such that in 12 months' time, in 18 months' time, whatever it might be, you've got a non-white face with some wine education and some work experience, and you've got someone who can kind of fit seamlessly into the wine world. That's what we're doing so far. That's been growing so far. And I think I'll just kind of keep it short and sweet. That's it from me, really.
That's fantastic. I was the similarities with the National Indigenous Culinary Institute, talking about role models, Cathy spoke about alumni, you spoke about role models, but it's that work experience, it's that practical application to just gain the confidence to apply the study that's been done. That's the equity, and that's the driving of the equity that you're achieving with the students that you're giving these opportunities to. Really inspiring, and I see that Curly Haslam-Coates down in Tasmania has an APP, and she's embracing and running with it. So I may ask the panel, once we've finished this session, would there be the opportunity to consider a catch-up at some point in time in the future, that if we wanted to have a session and a collaboration to share more ideas, whether anyone would be interested. And just a question to put out there for anyone in the audience, if you would find that beneficial, if there are enough people that are interested, let's see if we can make it happen. I'm going to hand over to you now, Waggy, for some questions. If anyone's got any questions for Mags, please.
Yes, and thank you, Mags, for sharing. That was very, very powerful. And I can definitely relate with the story. We have no questions at the moment for Mags, but feel free to post them into the Q&A, guys. We do have a question for MIRKO, but if there's any questions for Mags based off of his presentation just now, please feel free to drop them in and we'll answer them in the Q&A. But yeah, Sarah, should we move into the Q&A?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. If there's a question for MIRKO, please, that would be great. Yeah.
So MIRKO, John Tomlinson's asking, how did you find your experience in Australia? Were you able to find work? Obviously, this is before the pandemic took place.
I think MIRKO just might need to refresh because he's on his phone, so that might just take a second or two.
Okay, no problem. I'm going to. Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
you. Perfect. So, John, thanks for the question. My finding, my experience in Australia was amazing. I think that Australia can be seen as an example for all over the world in terms of accessibility for the disability people, especially in wheelchair, in restaurant and in wine bar. And I worked hard before I went in Australia to find a job first in a restaurant and in a wine bar. So it was very, very difficult. And through connection from all over the world, I found a place in Melbourne. But as I said before, if you have any type of disability or diversity, the field of application in our industry can be infinite. So you can express yourself in a lot of type of things, in writing, etc. And as Australia, as Melbourne, I have saw other places in the United States accessible for the wheelchair, like Las Vegas, Miami. But I think that a lot of work, we must do a lot of work in Europe to change the accessibility for the people with disabilities. But in general, my experience in Australia was very incredible, and can't wait to come back there to start again a new experience.
Fantastic. And again, I just remember, like, you had some employment set up that lasted only a month, and then you spent several months in isolation without people being able to connect to you except online remotely. Yet you still have such a positive experience of Australia, and I know that you're already making plans to come back again. So I do look forward to us meeting in person in the near future, hopefully.
Yes. And we can wait for that.
Yes. How are we going on other questions, Waggy? Are there any others at this point in time?
There are no others at this point of time, but I just wanted to take the time to remind everybody to please fill out the diversity and inclusivity survey. The deadline is February the 26th. So yeah, just get around to that as soon as you can, and just absorbing a lot of the information and the powerful messages our panelists have actually delivered today. So very grateful for that.
Absolutely, very much content heavy in terms of story, and incredibly inspiring. That I think we're probably, the take home message is that a lot of us are on the same page. We're using similar language. We've got similar aims. We all want to create action, and collectively that is about striving for equity. And if we can work together smarter, we will achieve that eventually. I would like to say thank you so much for the panel. I know we've got time zones all around the world. Thank you for the support behind the scenes. Hopefully you've all taken something away from this. If you do have any further queries, feel free to reach out to WSET Direct or to myself, and I can field them to our guests on the panel. But that said, I'd like to say also thanks very much to Waggy for the support, and wish you all a good morning, a good afternoon and a good evening, and enjoy the last day of the summit tomorrow. Thanks very much, everyone. And thank you, Cathy. Thank you, MIRKO. Thank you, Mags.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.